The blood-red sunset cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Promise Creek as Frances Tanner stumbled forward, one hand clutching her swollen belly, the other bracing against the rough wooden wall of the general store. 8 months pregnant, alone, and desperate, she had traveled for weeks to reach this small frontier town in the Arizona Territory, 1875, with nothing but the clothes on her back and a fading hope of finding refuge. Frances wiped the sweat from her brow, her golden brown hair falling in tangled waves around her dirt-streaked face. Her husband's death at the hands of outlaws 3 months ago had left her with nothing but debts and a child on the way. The banker in her hometown had given her 2 choices: work off her husband's debts in his personal service or leave town immediately. She had chosen the latter, selling her wedding ring for passage west, where rumors of opportunity and second chances beckoned. "Please," she whispered to an elderly woman passing by. "Is there work to be found here? Anything at all?" The woman regarded Frances with pity, but shook her head. "Not for a woman in your condition, I'm afraid." Frances closed her eyes against the wave of despair threatening to drown her. The journey had depleted what little money she had, and she hadn't eaten since yesterday morning. As darkness fell across the town, she found herself outside the Rusty Nail Saloon, the sounds of raucous laughter and piano music spilling onto the street. Swallowing her pride, Frances pushed through the swinging doors. The smell of whiskey, tobacco, and unwashed bodies assaulted her senses. A dozen pairs of eyes turned toward her as she entered, conversation dying like a flame doused with water. The saloon owner, a heavy-set man with a thick mustache, approached her with narrowed eyes. "We don't serve your kind here, lady. This ain't no place for decent women." "I need work," Frances said, her voice barely audible above the piano. "Any work. I can clean, serve drinks, wash dishes," the man laughed, the sound harsh and mocking. "Look at you, about to burst any day now. What use would you be?" She felt tears welling in her eyes, but forced them back. "I'll work twice as hard as anyone. I'll beg if I must." A chair scraped across the wooden floor. A tall man rose from a corner table, spurs jingling with each deliberate step as he approached. Weston Lockhart was not a man easily forgotten, once seen. His eyes, the color of storm clouds, contrasted sharply with sun-darkened skin. A faded scar ran along his jawline, disappearing into the collar of his worn denim shirt. The silver star pinned to his leather vest caught the lamplight as he moved. "You'll never beg again," he said, his voice low and steady, addressing Frances while his gaze remained fixed on the saloon owner. "Not in this town." The room fell silent as the piano player's fingers stilled on the keys. The saloon owner shifted uncomfortably under the tall man's stare. "Sheriff," he muttered, "I was just explaining to this lady that—" "I heard what you were explaining, Donovan." The sheriff turned to Frances, his expression softening slightly. "Madam, there's a boarding house down the street. Mrs. Henderson takes in folks who need help from time to time." Frances shook her head. "I have no money to pay for lodging." "You'll stay there tonight as my guest," the sheriff said. "And tomorrow, we'll figure something out." "Why would you help me?" Frances asked, suspicion creeping into her voice. In her experience, men rarely offered assistance without expecting something in return. The sheriff's mouth twitched, almost forming a smile. "Because in Promise Creek, we don't let women and children sleep on the streets. That's why." As he escorted her from the saloon, Frances felt the stares of the patrons burning into her back. The night air was cool against her flushed skin. "Sheriff Lockhart," he said by way of introduction as they walked. "Weston Lockhart." "Frances Tanner," she replied. "Thank you for your kindness, Sheriff, but I don't want charity. I need honest work." "There's no shame in accepting help when you need it, Mrs. Tanner." He glanced at her swollen belly. "When is the baby due?" "About a month, I think." She hesitated. "My husband. He died 3 months ago." Outlaws attacked our farm in Kansas. The sheriff nodded, his expression revealing nothing. I'm sorry for your loss. They walked in silence until they reached a two-story building with a neatly painted sign, Henderson's boarding house. A plump woman with silver-streaked hair answered the door, her expression shifting from annoyance to concern when she saw Francis. Mabel, Sheriff Lockhart said, "This is Mrs. Tanner. She needs a room for the night." Mrs. Henderson's eyes darted between the sheriff and Francis. "Of course, Weston. Come in, dear. You look dead on your feet." As Francis stepped into the warm interior of the boarding house, the sheriff touched the brim of his hat in farewell. "Get some rest, Mrs. Tanner. I'll return in the morning." True to his word, Sheriff Lockhart arrived shortly after sunrise. Frances had slept deeply for the first time in weeks, her body grateful for the clean bed and quiet room. Mrs. Henderson had provided a simple but hearty breakfast, asking no questions about Frances's circumstances. The sheriff stood in the parlor, hat in hands, as Frances descended the stairs. He looked different in the morning light, younger perhaps, though the lines around his eyes spoke of a man who had seen his share of hardship. "I think I might have found something for you," he said without preamble. "Doc Miller's wife passed last winter. He's been looking for someone to help keep his house and assist with patients." Frances's heart lifted. "I have experience with nursing. My mother was a midwife." A genuine smile crossed the sheriff's face, transforming his stern features. "That's fortunate. The doc's getting on in years and could use the help." Dr. Miller proved to be a kindly man in his 60s with a perpetual stoop and thinning white hair. His small medical practice occupied the front portion of his house, while living quarters filled the back. After a brief interview, during which Frances demonstrated her knowledge of common remedies and medical terminology, the doctor agreed to hire her as his housekeeper and assistant. "You can have the spare bedroom," he said, showing her a small but clean room at the back of the house. "The work won't be easy, mind you. Folks around here are always getting themselves shot, trampled, or coming down with fevers." "I'm not afraid of hard work, Doctor," Frances assured him. "Good. And when your time comes," he nodded toward her belly, "we'll see you through it." Frances turned to Sheriff Lockhart, who had remained silent during the exchange. "I don't know how to thank you." He shrugged, his expression unreadable. "No need for thanks. Just doing my job." "Your job is to enforce the law, not find employment for wayward women," she said. "In a town this size, sheriff does what needs doing." He placed his hat back on his head. "Good day, Mrs. Tanner, document." As the weeks passed, Frances settled into life in Promise Creek. Her duties at Dr. Miller's kept her busy, but the work was satisfying. She cleaned the house, prepared meals, assisted with patients, and even began keeping the doctor's disorganized accounts in order. Dr. Miller was impressed with her intelligence and medical knowledge, and gradually entrusted her with more responsibilities. The townspeople, initially wary of the pregnant stranger, slowly accepted her presence. Mrs. Henderson from the boarding house became a regular visitor, bringing freshly baked bread and gossip in equal measure. Even some of the men who had been in the saloon that first night nodded respectfully when they saw her in town. Sheriff Lockhart, however, remained an enigma. He checked on her occasionally, his visits brief and formal. Frances found herself watching for him from the window of the doctor's office, curious about the man who had rescued her from destitution. "The sheriff's not much for talking," Dr. Miller remarked one evening as they prepared supper after a busy day of patients. "Never has been. Not since he came to Promise Creek 5 years ago." "Where did he come from?" Frances asked, trying to sound merely curious as she kneaded dough for biscuits. The doctor's eyes twinkled knowingly. "Texas, originally. Fought for the Confederacy, though he doesn't speak of it. Rumor has it he was a Texas Ranger for a spell after the war." "And what brought him here?" "Same thing that brings most men to these parts. Running from something, I expect." The doctor stroked his beard thoughtfully. There was trouble, something about a woman and her husband. Weston doesn't drink much, but when he does, sometimes he mentions a name. Rebecca. Francis felt an unexpected pang of disappointment. His wife. Don't think so. Never clarified, and I never press. The doctor changed the subject. How are you feeling? Any contractions yet? Some tightening, nothing regular, Francis admitted. The baby's been active today. Won't be long now, Dr. Miller said with a paternal smile. You should rest more. You've been on your feet too much. Francis shook her head. I need to earn my keep, doctor. You've more than earned it, child. I don't know how I managed before you came. That night, as Francis lay in bed, her thoughts drifted to Sheriff Lockhart. Who was Rebecca? A lost love? A wife? And what had happened to drive him to this remote corner of the Arizona Territory? Despite her best efforts to focus on her impending motherhood and her new life in Promise Creek, she found herself increasingly preoccupied with the taciturn lawman. Her musings were interrupted by a sharp pain that took her breath away. She sat up, hands moving to her belly as warm liquid soaked the bed beneath her. Her water had broken. Dr. Miller, she called out, her voice tight with pain and fear. What followed was a night of agony unlike anything Francis had experienced. Dr. Miller remained calm throughout, coaching her through each contraction, but by dawn, both were exhausted and Francis's progress had stalled. The baby's turned wrong, the doctor murmured, concern etching deeper lines into his weathered face. I need to get help. Francis grabbed his arm, panic rising in her chest. Don't leave me. Just for a moment, my dear. I'm going to send for Sheriff Lockhart and Mrs. Henderson. We need more hands. Through a haze of pain, Francis was vaguely aware of voices, additional people entering the room. Cool hands bathed her forehead with water. Someone held her upright while the doctor examined her again. Mrs. Tanner, Sheriff Lockhart's voice cut through her pain. He was kneeling beside the bed, his face level with hers. Francis, look at me. She forced her eyes open, meeting his steady gaze. The baby's shoulder is stuck. Doc needs to turn it, and it's going to hurt like hell. But you need to stay with us. Understand? Francis nodded weakly. Good. Now, take my hands and squeeze as hard as you need to. She gripped his calloused hands as the doctor worked. The pain was blinding, causing her to arch off the bed with a scream that seemed to come from someone else's throat. You're doing fine, the sheriff said, his voice firm but gentle. Just fine. I can't, she gasped between contractions. I can't do this. Yes, you can. You're the strongest woman I've met, and I've known some strong women in my time. Another wave of pain crashed over her, and Francis squeezed his hands with all her might, certain she must be breaking bones. The sheriff never flinched. I see the head, Dr. Miller announced. One more big push, Francis. With the last reserves of her strength, Francis bore down. There was a moment of intense pressure, then sudden relief as her child slipped into the world with a lusty wail. You have a daughter, the doctor said, his voice thick with emotion as he placed the squirming, red-faced infant on Francis's chest. Francis looked down at her daughter in wonder, tears streaming down her face. The baby had a shock of dark hair and a tiny rosebud mouth that was currently expressing extreme displeasure at being evicted from her warm, comfortable home. She's perfect, Francis whispered. She became aware that Sheriff Lockhart was still holding one of her hands, and when she looked up, she was startled to see moisture in his usually stoic eyes. What will you name her? Mrs. Henderson asked, beaming at the mother and child. Francis gazed at her daughter, considering. Hope, she said finally. Her name is Hope. Sheriff Lockhart nodded approval. A good name. As Mrs. Henderson and the doctor busied themselves with cleaning up, the sheriff reluctantly released Francis's hand. You should rest now. You both should. Francis caught his sleeve as he turned to leave. Thank you, Sheriff Lockhart, for everything. He touched the brim of an imaginary hat, a gesture that had become familiar to her. Weston, he said. My friends call me Weston. The days following Hope's birth passed in a blur of exhaustion and joy for Francis. The tiny cabin behind Dr. Miller's practice became a parade of well-wishers bringing gifts for the new baby. Mrs. Henderson arrived daily with meals and stayed to help with household chores. Even the saloon owner, Donovan, sent over a small carved wooden horse with a grudging note of congratulations. Sheriff Lockhart Weston visited every evening after his rounds. At first, his visits were brief, almost awkward, as if he was fulfilling an obligation to check on them. But gradually, the visits lengthened. He would sit in the chair beside Francis's bed, sometimes holding Hope while Francis ate her supper, his large hands cradling the infant with surprising gentleness. You're good with her, Francis remarked one evening, 2 weeks after the birth, as Weston rocked Hope to sleep. He looked down at the sleeping infant, his expression softening in a way Francis had never seen before. Had a little sister once. Helped raise her after our ma died. Where is she now? Your sister? A shadow crossed his face. Yellow fever took her. She was 16. I'm sorry, Francis said, reaching out to touch his arm. It was the first time she had initiated contact between them since the night of Hope's birth. Weston nodded, carefully placing the sleeping baby in the cradle beside Francis's bed. It was a long time ago. And your father? Died at Gettysburg. Confederate side. He met her eyes, as if gauging her reaction. I followed him into the war when I was 18. Not something I'm proud of now. Francis considered his words. The war made victims of us all, one way or another. He studied her face. You don't sound like most women I've met. Is that good or bad? A hint of a smile played at his lips.
Good.
Definitely good. As Francis regained her strength, she resumed her duties at Dr. Miller's practice, though now with Hope strapped to her chest in a sling. The doctor doted on the baby, claiming her as a granddaughter of sorts, and patients seemed to enjoy the infant's presence during their visits. Summer gave way to autumn, and Promise Creek prepared for the coming winter. One crisp October morning, as Francis was inventorying medical supplies in the doctor's office, Weston burst through the door, supporting a blood-soaked young man. Ambush on the Silverado Trail, he said tersely. Where's the doc? House call at the Wilson Ranch, Francis replied, immediately clearing the examination table. Help me get him up here. The wounded man groaned as they lifted him onto the table. Francis cut away his shirt to reveal a gunshot wound to the shoulder, blood pulsing steadily from the jagged hole. Bullet still in there, she muttered, pressing a clean cloth against the wound. I need to get it out and stop the bleeding. Weston's eyes widened. Shouldn't we wait for the doc? Francis shook her head, already gathering instruments. He could bleed to death before the doctor returns. I've assisted with bullet removals before. She worked methodically, cleaning the wound, administering laudanum for the pain, and using forceps to extract the bullet lodged against the young man's shoulder blade. Weston assisted without question, following her instructions to hold instruments, provide clean cloths, and help restrain the patient when necessary. When the bullet finally came free with a sickening pop, Francis dropped it into a basin with a sigh of relief. She stitched the wound closed with neat, even sutures, then bandaged it tightly. He'll need rest, and to keep the wound clean, she told Weston as they moved the now unconscious patient to a recovery bed. But he should recover fully. Weston stared at her with newfound respect. Where did you learn to do that? Francis washed blood from her hands in a basin of water. My father was a doctor in Kansas City before we moved to the farm. I grew up assisting him. She smiled sadly. He wanted me to be a proper lady, not a doctor, but I learned anyway, watching him work. You make a fine doctor, Weston said. Francis laughed. A woman doctor? In this territory? I don't think the world is ready for that. The world might not be, but you are. His gaze was intense, admiring. You saved that boy's life today. Francis felt heat rise to her cheeks at his praise. What happened to him? You said there was an ambush. Weston's expression darkened. Stage robbery. This boy was riding shotgun on the Silverado stage. Driver was killed outright. Four masked men took the strongbox and mail pouch. He ran a hand through his hair in frustration. Third robbery in as many months. Do you know who's responsible? I have my suspicions. Gang led by a man named Hardin, operating out of the mountains to the north. He sighed heavily. I'm going to need to organize a posse, track them to their hideout. Francis felt a cold dread settle in her stomach. That sounds dangerous. Part of the job, he said with a shrug, but his eyes softened at her concern.
Don't worry about me. Evefest vers odds.
When will you go? Tomorrow, at first light. With luck, we'll pick up their trail before it goes cold. Francis nodded, trying to hide her worry. In the months since Hope's birth, Weston had become an important part of their lives. The thought of him riding into danger made her chest tighten with fear. That evening, after putting Hope to bed, Francis heard a knock at her door. Weston stood on the threshold, looking uncomfortable in a clean shirt, his hair still damp from washing. I thought I'd say goodbye properly, he said, hat in hand. Since I'm leaving at dawn. Francis invited him in, suddenly aware of her simple dress and hair loosely braided for sleep. Would you like some coffee? Or, I have a little whiskey the doctor keeps for medicinal purposes. Coffee would be fine, thank you. She busied herself at the stove, acutely conscious of his presence in the small room. When she turned with 2 steaming cups, she found him standing by Hope's cradle, watching the sleeping infant. She's growing so fast, he remarked, accepting the coffee. Seems like yesterday she was born. Almost 3 months now, Francis said, sitting at the small table. She's starting to smile. Real smiles, not just gas. Weston chuckled, joining her at the table. She looks like you. Same eyes. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, sipping their coffee. Francis gathered her courage. How long will you be gone? She asked.
Hard to say.
Few days, maybe a week if we have to track them into the mountains. Francis nodded, trying to appear casual. Well, we'll be here when you get back. Hope will miss her evening visits. Weston set down his cup, his expression serious. Francis, there's something I need to tell you. Something about my past. Her heart quickened. You don't owe me any explanations, Weston. I think I do. He took a deep breath. Before I came to Promise Creek, I was a ranger in Texas. I was engaged to a woman named Rebecca Hardin. Francis felt as if the air had been sucked from the room. Hardin? Like the outlaw you mentioned? Weston nodded grimly. Her brother, Elias Hardin. He was wanted for murder in 3 states. I was part of the team that tracked him down. His hands tightened around the coffee cup. When we found him, Rebecca was with him. She'd been helping him all along, feeding him information about ranger movements. What happened? Francis asked softly.
There was a shootout.
Rebecca pulled a gun, aimed it at my partner. Weston's voice was flat, emotionless. I shot her. She didn't die, but she was badly wounded. Last I heard, she recovered and joined her brother's gang full-time. Francis reached across the table and placed her hand over his. You did what you had to do.
Did I?
His eyes met hers, filled with old pain. I loved her, Francis. And I shot her. Then I ran away, came here to hide from what I'd done. You're not hiding, Francis said firmly. You're serving this community. Protecting people. He turned his hand to grasp hers. The thing is, Elias Hardin is the man behind these stage robberies. And if he discovers I'm the sheriff here? Understanding dawned on Francis. He'll come for you. For revenge. Not just for me. For anyone I care about. His grip tightened on her hand. That's why I've kept my distance, tried not to. He trailed off. Try not to care too much? Francis finished for him. Weston nodded, his expression tortured. But I failed that.
Icare, Francis. About you.
About hope. More than I should. Francis's heart pounded in her chest. I care about you too, she whispered. For a moment, it seemed he might kiss her. Instead, he released her hand and stood abruptly. That's why I need to end this. Hardin and his gang. Before they can hurt anyone else. Be careful, Francis said, rising to stand before him. Come back to us. Weston reached out, his fingers barely brushing her cheek. I'll try my best. After he left, Francis stood at the window for a long time, watching his tall figure disappear into the darkness. Fear and something else, something warm and fragile, bloomed in her chest. She had not expected to find such feelings again after her husband's death, especially not for a man as complicated as Weston Lockhart. The next morning, Francis watched from the doctor's office window as Weston rode out of town with 5 other men, all heavily armed and grim-faced. Hope fussed in her sling, sensing her mother's anxiety. There, Francis soothed, bouncing gently. He'll come back. He has to. Days passed with no word from the posse. Francis threw herself into her work at the doctor's practice, trying not to count the hours since Weston's departure. On the 4th day, one of the posse members returned, exhausted and trail-worn, with news that they had tracked the gang to a canyon in the northern mountains and were preparing to move in. Sheriff sent me back to get supplies and let folks know we're all right, the man explained to the crowd that gathered around him in the general store. Says we should be back in a few more days, God willing. Francis felt both relief and renewed anxiety at the news. That night, she dreamed of gunfire and blood, of Weston lying wounded in a remote canyon while a woman with Rebecca Hardin's faceless form stood over him, laughing. She woke with a start to the sound of Hope crying. As she fed her daughter in the pre-dawn darkness, Francis made a decision. She could not simply wait and worry. Dr. Miller, she said when the elderly physician arrived for breakfast, I need to ask a favor. By mid-morning, Francis had arranged for Mrs. Henderson to care for Hope for a few days and borrowed a sturdy mare from the livery stable.
Dr.
Miller had protested vigorously but eventually relented, providing her with medical supplies and extracting a promise that she would be careful. You're in love with him, aren't you? The doctor asked as Francis prepared to leave. She paused in adjusting her saddle. I don't know what I feel, she admitted. But I know I can't sit here waiting to find out if he's dead or alive. What if you ride into a gunfight? What about Hope? Francis felt a stab of guilt. Hope has you, and Mrs. Henderson. If something happens to me, I know you'll raise her well. She mounted the horse with determination. But I'm not planning on anything happening. I'm just going to make sure West and all of them have medical attention if they need it. The doctor sighed in resignation. Follow the North Trail until you reach Split Rock Canyon. The posse was heading toward the old mining camp beyond it. Francis had never ridden so far alone. The trail wound through increasingly rugged terrain, the autumn sun warm on her back as the mare picked her way carefully over rocky ground. By late afternoon, she reached Split Rock Canyon, a narrow passage between towering red cliffs split by an ancient earthquake. As she entered the canyon, the hairs on the back of her neck stood up. It was too quiet, no birds, no insects, nothing but the sound of her horse's hooves on stone. Francis slowed, suddenly alert to potential danger. The crack of a rifle shot echoed through the canyon, followed by the whine of a bullet ricocheting off rock near her head. Francis ducked instinctively, spurring her horse forward as more shots rang out. She rounded a bend in the canyon at full gallop, heart pounding in her chest. Ahead, the canyon opened into a wider space where a group of men had taken cover behind boulders. With a surge of relief, Francis recognized Weston among them, firing a rifle at unseen attackers higher up the canyon walls. "Francis," he shouted in disbelief as she galloped toward them. "Get down!" She slid from the saddle as a bullet struck her horse, causing the animal to rear in pain and terror. Francis hit the ground hard, rolling behind a boulder as the wounded mare bolted back the way they had come. Weston appeared beside her, his face a mask of fury and fear. "What in God's name are you doing here?" "I brought medical supplies," she gasped, winded from her fall. "I thought you might need help." "We need help, all right, but not the kind that gets you killed." He fired his rifle over the boulder, then ducked back down. "Hardin and his men have us pinned. Been exchanging shots for an hour." Francis peered cautiously over the rock. She could make out several figures on the canyon rim, using the high ground to their advantage. "Anyone hurt?" she asked, pulling her medical bag closer. Johnson took one in the leg. "Nothing fatal." Weston's anger seemed to subside, replaced by resignation. "Since you're here, you might as well make yourself useful. He's behind that outcropping with Taylor." Francis crawled to where the wounded man lay, applying a tourniquet to slow the bleeding from his thigh. As she worked, she assessed the situation. The posse was outnumbered and in a poor tactical position. Without reinforcements or a change in circumstances, their chances looked grim. "How many of them are there?" she asked Taylor, the youngest member of the posse, as she bandaged Johnson's leg. "7, maybe 8, the young man replied, his face pale with fear. "Sheriff says Hardin himself is up there." Francis finished treating Johnson and made her way back to Weston, who was conferring with his deputy. "We need to draw their fire away from the others," Weston was saying. "If we can create a diversion, maybe a couple of the men can make it back to town for help." "I'll go," the deputy offered. Weston shook his head. "You're the best shot. I need you here." "I could go," Francis suggested. Both men stared at her as if she'd lost her mind. "Absolutely not," Weston said flatly. "Think about it," Francis insisted. "They're less likely to shoot a woman. And I know the way back. I could bring help." Weston's jaw clenched. "It's too dangerous, Francis. I won't risk it." "You're not risking it. I am. My choice." She met his gaze steadily. "My horse is gone, but I can make it on foot through the narrow part of the canyon. Once I'm past that, I'll move faster." Before Weston could argue further, a new voice called out from above. "Lockhart, I know you're down there." Weston froze, his expression hardening. "Hardin," he muttered. "How about we parley?" the voice continued. "Just you and me face to face. For old time's sake." Weston exchanged glances with his deputy. "He's trying to draw me out." "I brought someone who's been dying to see you again," Hardin called. "Rebecca, say hello to your former fiancé." A woman's voice echoed through the canyon. "Hello, Weston. Still hiding behind a badge, I see." Francis watched as Weston's face drained of color. She placed a hand on his arm. "Don't listen to them. It's a trap." "I know," he said grimly. "But as long as they're focused on me, it gives the rest of you a chance." He turned to his deputy. "Give me 5 minutes of covering fire, then get Francis and the others out of here. Head back to town for reinforcements."
"Weston, no," Francis pleaded.
"There has to be another way." He cupped her face in his hands, his eyes softening as they met hers. "There isn't. But I need to know you'll be safe." Before she could respond, he leaned forward and kissed her briefly, his lips warm against hers. "Get hope. Live your life." Then he was gone, moving to a position where he could call up to Hardin. "I'm coming out to talk."
"Just me."
"Hold your fire." "Sheriff, this is crazy," the deputy hissed, but Weston ignored him, checking his revolver before standing. "I'm coming up the trail to your left," he he shouted to Hardin. Alone, and with my hands where you can see them. Francis watched in horror as Weston stepped out from behind cover, hands raised slightly, and began climbing a narrow trail up the canyon wall. The outlaws held their fire as he ascended. Get ready to move, the deputy told Francis and the other posse members. As soon as there's a distraction, we head back down the canyon. Francis shook her head. I'm not leaving him. Madam, the sheriff gave orders. I don't care about his orders. Francis reached into her medical bag and removed a small Derringer pistol Dr. Miller had insisted she carry. I'm going after him. Before the deputy could stop her, Francis darted to another position, using the rocks for cover as she began to follow the same trail Weston had taken. Above, she could hear voices, Weston's measured tones contrasting with another man's harsher, mocking cadence. Thought you could hide forever in this backwater town, the second voice Hardin was saying as Francis drew closer. But news travels, even to outlaws like me. I wasn't hiding, Elias, Weston replied. Just trying to live with what I did. A woman laughed, the sound cold and brittle. What you did? You shot me, Weston. Your own fiancé. You were about to kill my partner, Rebecca. You gave me no choice. Francis peered carefully around a boulder. About 20 feet ahead, on a small plateau halfway up the canyon wall, stood Weston facing a man and woman. The man was tall and lean, with a shock of red hair and a savage scar across one cheek. The woman beside him was strikingly beautiful despite the hardness in her eyes and the matching scar that marred her otherwise perfect features. There's always a choice, Rebecca said, stepping closer to Weston. You chose the law over me. Over us. You chose your brother over me, Weston countered. Over everything we could have had. Enough reminiscing, Hardin interrupted. You know why we're here, Lockhart. You took something from my sister. Her beauty, her future. Now we're going to take everything from you. Francis's blood ran cold as Hardin drew his pistol and pointed it at Weston's chest. Starting with your life. Weston! Francis screamed, emerging from her hiding place with her small Derringer aimed at Hardin. All three turned toward her in shock. In that moment of distraction, Weston moved with lightning speed, drawing his revolver and firing at Hardin. The outlaw leader staggered back, clutching a shoulder, as Rebecca drew her own weapon. Francis fired her Derringer at Rebecca, the shot going wide but causing the woman to dive for cover. Gunfire erupted from below as the deputy and remaining posse members provided covering fire, bullets pinging off rocks around the plateau. Weston grabbed Francis's arm, pulling her behind a large boulder as bullets whizzed past. Are you out of your mind? He shouted over the din. I told you to leave. I couldn't, she replied, her voice shaking. I couldn't leave you to die. More shots rang out, some from above, where the rest of Hardin's gang was positioned. They were caught in a crossfire, trapped on the exposed slope. We need to get back down, Weston said, assessing their precarious position. Stay low and move when I tell you. A bullet struck the rock inches from Francis's head, showering her with stone fragments. She gasped in pain as one sliced her cheek. You're bleeding, Weston said, concern replacing anger. It's nothing. Francis touched her cheek, fingers coming away red. Just a scratch. A woman's voice called out from nearby. Weston? Remember when we used to talk about having children together? Rebecca's voice was eerily calm amid the chaos of gunfire. Weston tensed beside Francis. I see you found someone else to have them with, Rebecca continued. The pregnant woman from town. Though not pregnant anymore, I notice. Francis felt Weston's arm tighten protectively around her. Does she know, Weston? About what you did to me. About how you left me for dead. Rebecca's voice grew closer. Did you tell her you're a coward who runs when things get difficult? Don't listen to her, Francis whispered. She's trying to draw you out. Weston's jaw clenched. I know. But she's also getting closer while Hardin and the others keep us pinned. A plan formed in Francis's mind. Give me your bandana, she whispered urgently. Weston looked confused, but handed over the red cloth he wore around his neck. Francis quickly tied it to a piece of driftwood from the canyon floor and held it up. What are you doing? Weston hissed. Creating a diversion. Francis thrust the makeshift flag up above their boulder, waving it slightly. Immediately, several shots hit it, tearing through the fabric. While the outlaw's attention was on the decoy, Francis crawled to a position where she could see Rebecca approaching from behind another boulder. The woman was focused on their previous hiding spot, unaware they had moved. Francis picked up a rock and threw it with all her might, striking Rebecca in the back. The outlaw woman whirled, gun raised, giving Weston the opening he needed. His shot caught Rebecca in the shoulder, spinning her around and sending her weapon flying.
Now!
Weston shouted, grabbing Francis's hand as they scrambled down the slope, bullets kicking up dust at their heels. They reached the bottom of the canyon where the deputy and others provided covering fire for their retreat. As they ran for the narrow passage that would lead them back toward town, Francis heard a scream of rage from above. Glancing back, she saw Rebecca standing at the edge of the plateau, blood staining her shirt, her face contorted with hatred. This isn't over, Weston, she shrieked. I'll find you. I'll find both of you. Then they were through the passage, the canyon walls providing temporary shelter from the outlaws' bullets. The posse members regrouped, checking wounds and ammunition. Johnson can't travel fast, the deputy reported. He's lost a lot of blood. Weston nodded grimly. We'll make a stretcher. Taylor, Harrison, you two carry him. Williams, you scout ahead. Deputy, cover our rear. We move as quickly as possible. As the men prepared to move out, Weston turned to Francis, his expression a mixture of admiration and exasperation. That was either the bravest or most foolish thing I've ever seen. Perhaps both, she admitted with a faint smile. But I couldn't let you sacrifice yourself. Not when. When what? He asked softly. Not when Hope and I need you, Francis finished, her voice barely above a whisper. Weston touched her injured cheek gently. When we get back to town, if we get back, we need to talk about this. About us. Sheriff. Williams called from ahead. Riders coming. Everyone tensed, weapons raised, until Williams waved excitedly. It's a rescue party from town. Doc Miller raised the alarm when Francis didn't return. Relief washed over the group as a dozen armed men appeared around the bend, led by Dr. Miller himself on his ancient mare. The doctor dismounted with surprising agility for his age, rushing to Francis. My dear girl, are you hurt? When your horse returned without you, I feared the worst. I'm fine, Francis assured him, though her legs suddenly felt weak with delayed shock. Just a scratch on my cheek. And the rest of you? The doctor asked, surveying the posse. Johnson took a bullet in the leg, Weston reported. Otherwise, just minor injuries. But Hardin and his gang are still up in the canyon, and they're out for blood. One of the newcomers, a grizzled miner named Peterson, spat tobacco juice onto the ground. Not for long, they ain't. We brought enough men and firepower to flush them out proper. Or we could blast them out, another suggested, patting saddlebags that Francis realized with alarm contained dynamite. Weston shook his head firmly. No unnecessary risks or casualties. We do this by the book. He turned to Francis. You and Johnson head back to town with Doc Miller. The rest of us will deal with Hardin. I'm not leaving you again, Francis insisted. This isn't a debate, Francis, Weston said, his sheriff's authority returning to his voice. You've done enough. More than enough. Now go home to Hope. At the mention of her daughter, Francis felt her resolve waver. She had responsibilities beyond her feelings for Weston. Reluctantly, she nodded. Promise me you'll come back, she said, holding his gaze. I promise, he replied solemnly. We have that talk waiting for us, remember? As Francis rode back to Promise Creek with Dr. Miller and the wounded Johnson, her thoughts remained with Weston and the men heading back into the canyon to confront the Hardin gang. The doctor had tried to engage her in conversation, but eventually gave up, respecting her worried silence. Night had fallen by the time they reached town. Mrs. Henderson met them at the doctor's house, hope cradled in her arms. The sight of her daughter brought tears to Frances's eyes as she gathered the infant close. She's been an angel, Mrs. Henderson assured her. Hardly fussed at all. It's as if she knew her mama was doing something important. After feeding Hope and settling her to sleep, Francis joined Dr. Miller in his parlor, where he was tending to Johnson's leg. Will there be others wounded? She asked, watching the doctor work. Almost certainly, he replied grimly. We should prepare for casualties. Through the long night, Francis helped the doctor organize supplies and prepare beds for the wounded. Hope slept peacefully in her cradle, unaware of her mother's fear and the danger facing the man who had become so important to both of them. Dawn was breaking when they heard the sound of horses approaching. Francis rushed to the window, her heart in her throat. A group of riders appeared through the morning mist, moving slowly down the main street. At their head rode Weston, his tall figure unmistakable even at a distance. Francis threw open the door and ran onto the porch, heedless of her disheveled appearance. As Weston dismounted, she saw a bloody bandage wrapped around his left arm, but he was alive and moving under his own power. Behind him came the posse members and rescue party, escorting 3 bound prisoners. Francis recognized Elias Hardin among them, his red hair matted with blood, his expression murderous. Rebecca, however, was nowhere to be seen. Weston approached Francis slowly, exhaustion evident in every line of his body. It's over, he said simply. 3 dead, 3 captured, including Hardin. 2 got away, including Rebecca. You're hurt, Francis said, reaching for his bandaged arm. Bullet grazed me. Nothing serious. He glanced toward the house. Hope. Sleeping. She's fine. Francis hesitated, aware of the men watching them. What happens now? Now I lock up these prisoners and send word to the territorial marshal. Weston's eyes held hers. Then I keep my promise about that talk. Later that afternoon, after the prisoners were secured and the wounded tended to, Weston appeared at Francis's door. He had bathed and changed into clean clothes, his injured arm properly bandaged by Dr. Miller. He looked younger somehow, as if a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. Francis invited him in, suddenly shy despite everything they had been through together. Hope lay awake in her cradle, gurgling happily at the sight of Weston. May I? He asked, gesturing to the baby. Francis nodded, watching as he lifted Hope with practiced ease, cradling her against his chest. The baby grabbed at his shirt buttons with tiny fingers, drawing a smile from the normally serious lawman. She likes you, Francis observed. The feeling's mutual, Weston replied, looking down at Hope with undisguised affection. He settled into a chair, still holding the baby. I've been thinking about what happened yesterday. About what you did. Francis braced herself for a lecture about recklessness or putting herself in danger. Instead, Weston continued in a softer tone. No one's ever done anything like that for me before. Risked their life for mine. I couldn't let you die, Francis said simply. I care about you too much. Weston's eyes met hers, filled with an emotion she hadn't seen before. When I saw you in that canyon, I was terrified. Not just because you were in danger, but because I realized in that moment how much I stand to lose. Hope cooed, reaching up to pat Weston's cheek, breaking the tension. They both laughed. Francis, Weston said, his voice turning serious again. I need to be honest with you. Rebecca's still out there. She's dangerous and vindictive, and she saw us together. As long as you and Hope are associated with me, there's a risk. Are you trying to push me away? For our protection? Francis asked, a note of challenge in her voice. No, he said firmly. I'm done running from the past. I'm done denying what I feel. He paused, choosing his words carefully. I love you, Francis. You and Hope both. I think I have since the night she was born. Francis felt tears welling in her eyes. I love you too, Weston. I didn't expect it, didn't plan for it, but there it is. I can't offer you a life free from danger, he warned. Not while I wear this badge, and not with enemies like the Hardens in the world. I don't want a life free from danger, Francis replied. I want a life with you in it. The rest we'll face together. Weston stood carefully, still holding Hope, and crossed to where Francis sat. He knelt before her, balancing the baby in one arm while taking Francis's hand with his free one. Then marry me, he said, his voice rough with emotion. Be my wife. Let me be a father to Hope. Let me love and protect you both for as long as I live. Tears spilled down Francis's cheeks as she nodded. Yes, she whispered. Yes, I'll marry you. Weston leaned forward, and their lips met in a gentle kiss, filled with promise and new beginnings. Hope squealed between them, as if adding her approval to the arrangement. 1 month later, on a crisp December morning, Francis Tanner became Francis Lockhart in a simple ceremony at Promise Creek's small church. Hope, dressed in a white gown made from one of Francis's old petticoats, was held by Dr. Miller, who beamed with paternal pride throughout the service. The entire town turned out for the celebration that followed. Even Donovan, the saloon owner who had once turned Francis away, contributed barrels of his best whiskey for the occasion. As Francis and Weston danced under strings of lanterns in the town square, she remembered that desperate night when she had first arrived in Promise Creek, pregnant and alone, willing to beg for any work she could find. What are you thinking about? Weston asked, noticing her distant expression. About how much has changed, she replied, smiling up at him. About how I once told you I would beg, if I must. Weston's arms tightened around her waist. And I told you that you would never beg again. Not in this town. You kept your promise, Francis said softly. I intend to keep all my promises to you, he murmured, bending to kiss her as the townspeople cheered. Winter gave way to spring, and spring to summer. As the first anniversary of Francis's arrival in Promise Creek approached, life had settled into a comfortable rhythm. She continued working with Dr. Miller, who had begun teaching her more advanced medical procedures, treating her more as an apprentice than an assistant. Weston remained sheriff, keeping the peace in the growing town with firm but fair leadership. Hope, now walking and beginning to form words, was the center of their world. Francis watched with joy as Weston transformed from the serious, reserved lawman into a doting father who would get down on all fours to play horsey or spend hours building block towers for Hope to knock down. There had been no sign of Rebecca Harden since the Canyon shootout. Elias Harden and his capture men had been tried and sentenced to long terms in the territorial prison. Occasionally, Francis would catch Weston scanning the horizon with a worried expression, but those moments grew less frequent as time passed. On a warm July evening, as they sat on the porch of their new home, a small but sturdy house Weston had built on the edge of town, Francis decided it was time to share her news. I saw Dr. Miller today, she said casually, watching Hope chase fireflies in the yard. Everything all right? Weston asked, instantly alert to any hint of trouble. Francis smiled, taking his hand and placing it on her still flat stomach. Everything is perfect. We're going to have another baby. Weston's face transformed with wonder. Really? When? Early winter, the doctor thinks. Around Christmas. He pulled her into his arms, burying his face in her hair. I never thought I could be this happy, he whispered. Never thought I deserved it. You deserve every happiness, Francis assured him, holding him close. We both do. As the sun set over Promise Creek, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Frances reflected on the journey that had brought her here from desperate, pregnant widow to beloved wife, mother, and respected healer. Life on the frontier would never be easy or entirely safe, but with Weston beside her and their children to raise, she faced the future without fear. They had found each other in the unlikeliest of circumstances, two wounded souls healing together. Whatever challenges tomorrow might bring, Frances knew one thing with absolute certainty: she would never have to beg again. 5 years later, Frances stood in the doorway of their expanded home, watching as Weston taught 7-year-old Hope to ride her new pony in the paddock behind the house. 4-year-old William, named after Weston's father, sat atop the fence, clapping excitedly as his sister trotted in a careful circle. Baby Elizabeth, just 8 months old, gurgled in Frances's arms, reaching toward her father and siblings with chubby hands. Promise Creek had grown into a proper town with a school, where Frances taught basic medical knowledge alongside regular subjects, and a new, larger doctor's office where she worked as Dr. Miller's full partner. Weston still served as sheriff, though now with 3 deputies to help manage the expanding community. The shadows of the past had faded, but never completely disappeared. 2 years earlier, they had received word that Rebecca Hardin had been killed during a bank robbery in Colorado. Weston had received the news quietly, saying only that he hoped she had found peace in the end. As Frances watched her family, the family she had never expected to have again after her first husband's death, she felt a profound gratitude for the twists of fate that had brought her to this moment. From the depths of desperation to the heights of joy, her journey had been one of courage, love, and second chances. Hope waved excitedly from atop her pony. "Look, Mama, I'm doing it. I see you, sweetheart," Frances called back, waving. "You're a natural." Weston looked up, meeting her gaze across the yard. The love in his eyes still made her heart skip a beat, even after all these years. He smiled, touching the brim of his hat in the gesture that had become their private signal of affection. In that moment, as the western sun gilded her family in golden light, Frances knew that she had found something far greater than mere survival. She had found a home, a purpose, and a love strong enough to weather any storm the frontier might bring. And she had never had to beg again.